Imagine a man so feared by his enemies that they spoke his name like a warning, and yet so respected that the same men, bleeding and breathless on the battlefield, lowered their swords when he raised his hand. What kind of man bends the will of empires without breaking his code, who makes brutality ashamed of itself and forces history to whisper, "Behold, a different kind of conqueror"? Picture the desert night before a siege, stars like hammered silver, tents breathing in the wind, watchfires licking the edges of darkness. A rider moves along the line, not wrapped in gold but in discipline, not thundering orders but speaking quietly, because the truly powerful do not need to shout. Somewhere in those shadows, a boy who was not born a king has become the kind of leader kings pretend to be. He is Yusuf ibn Ayub Salahuddin, the righteousness of the faith, the lion whose roar was a vow to restrain the violence he commanded. You know fragments of the legend, the Frankish songs that turned an enemy into a chivalric ideal, the hand that returned a fallen foe to his horse, the waterskin pressed to a dying man's lips, even when that man had sworn to kill him at dawn. But listen closer, and you'll hear the quieter miracle. Cities taken without massacres. A holy city recovered from nearly a century of grief, not with fire, but with terms. A general who understood that victory is not how fiercely you strike, but how fully you control your own hand. Before the sun rises on Jerusalem and before banners bloom red across the horns of Hattin, ask yourself, how does a soft-spoken scholar become a storm? How does a man raised in the tremors of exile become the ground on which armies cannot shake him? And how, in a world that confuses spectacle for strength, does one leader prove that restraint can be more terrifying than rage? Follow the footprints in the sand. They belong to a lion who chose when to bare his teeth and when to sheathe them. His name was Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayub, and he moved through a fractured age like a hand gathering broken glass, not to admire his reflection in each shard, but to make the mirror whole again. He was Kurdish by blood, a child of a world split between great houses, the Abbasid caliph's moral horizon to the east, the fading Fatimid throne over the Nile, the Zengids in Syria, and the Latin principalities on the Mediterranean rim. Nervous, ironclad islands of certainty floating in a sea of doubt. To those who crossed him, he was Saladin, a word that struck fear like a trumpet in fog. To those who followed him, he was a physician for a sick century, a builder who learned to balance the weight of swords with the weight of mercy. And he matters now, perhaps more than ever, because the story of power today is still a story of impatience, vanity, and the cheap theater of victory. He refused that theater. He understood logistics the way a poet understands breath, water before steel, patience before spectacle, alliances woven like a carpet, each knot holding the pattern. He believed that faith without discipline is noise, that war without law is rot, and that a ruler who cannot master himself will eventually be mastered by his enemies. This is not a museum tour of names and dates. This is a night march through doubt and decision, through the letters he wrote and the silences he kept, through the moments when he chose not to kill and therefore won. You will meet a man who closed a caliphate without burning its libraries, who took a city holy to 3 faiths without reenacting the blood price that had once stained its stones. You will see why his enemies negotiated with him as if they were speaking to the idea of honor itself, and why his own soldiers carried not just obedience in their chests, but belief. And if you think this is only the past, look around. Leaders still dangle their people over the edge of pride. Armies still mistake noise for momentum. Civilians still pay for the theater of men who cannot govern their instincts. That is why he matters, because he proved there is another way to win. Step with me into the beginning, into a riverbank and a banishment, into a family riding out under a harsh moon. He was not born into glory. He was born into movement, into dust trails and shifting loyalties, into a childhood where permanence was a luxury. Salahuddin came into the world in 1137 in Tikrit, a fortress town perched on the Tigris River, where power and exile met in the same breath. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayub, was no king, but a soldier of quiet reputation, a man whose loyalty to his master would define his family's fate. On the very night of Salahuddin's birth, legend tells us, his father and uncle were forced to flee Tikrit, banished for aiding a fugitive. So while the infant Yusuf opened his eyes to life, his family was already galloping into uncertainty, carrying both the burden of disgrace and the strange blessing of destiny. Imagine that. Your very first cradle is the back of a horse, your lullaby the rhythm of hooves on earth, your inheritance the knowledge that the world can change its face overnight. For many, this would have been the beginning of obscurity, a boy born into exile, another forgotten child of a wandering soldier. But for Salahuddin, it became the first lesson. Greatness is not given at birth. It is carved in exile, in the dust and displacement, where you learn that home must sometimes be built with your own hands. His early years unfolded in Mosul and later Damascus, where the horizons of his youth were filled not with gold palaces, but with the clamor of bazaars, the solemnity of mosques, and the murmur of scholars debating the mysteries of law, philosophy, and faith. Yusuf was not the kind of child who dazzled with raw charisma or thundered with precocious authority. Instead, he was quiet, watchful, even described by chroniclers as shy. He studied the Quran with care, his eyes always lowered in humility, yet behind those lowered eyes, the seed of something unusual was forming. He absorbed stories of the Prophet and the caliphs, not as fables, but as living principles, maps for how one should move through a fractured world. While other boys of his age might have dreamt of banners and battles, Yusuf was captivated by the idea of justice, of order, of restraint, virtues that seemed almost alien in an age when ambition meant cruelty and conquest meant fire. But make no mistake, the boy who sat with scholars would soon ride with warriors. His uncle, Shirkuh, was a commander in the service of Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria, and from him Yusuf learned the harsh mathematics of survival, alliances that could collapse overnight, armies that moved like tides, and the endless tension between faith and power. Imagine being that young boy, listening in silence as warriors argued strategy over maps, hearing your uncle speak of Cairo, of Jerusalem, of lands held hostage by foreign crusaders. The boy said little, but his silence was not emptiness, it was absorption, like a desert storing every drop of rain. He was growing, not into the image of a flamboyant warlord, but into something rarer, a man who would carry both the scholar's pen and the warrior's sword in the same hand. The world that Salahuddin grew into was a storm. To the west, the Crusader states, those strange, fragile kingdoms carved out of conquest, clung to the Levant like armored parasites. They had been born of blood in 1099, when Jerusalem fell. To the First Crusade, its streets said to have run red with slaughter so deep it reached the knees of horses. By the time Yusuf ibn Ayub was growing into manhood, nearly 40 years had passed, and yet the Crusader presence was no fading shadow. Castles crowned the hills, from Antioch to Jerusalem, from Acre to Ascalon, their stone walls looming like permanent scars across a land meant to be shared by many. To the east, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad remained the symbolic heart of Islam, but its power had waned into little more than ritual. The caliph wore the robes of authority, but could command little beyond the palace walls. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, weakened by internal strife and theological division, was collapsing, a once great dynasty reduced to intrigue and assassination. And in Syria, Nur ad-Din, a ruler both feared and admired, stood as one of the few determined to push back against the Crusader tide. This was the chessboard of Salahuddin's youth. Fractured Muslim states, united in faith but divided in ambition. Crusader princes, calculating and brutal, and ordinary people, peasants and traders, who longed for stability while watching armies march across their fields like seasonal storms. It was into this world that Yusuf began his service, not as a star, but as a squire in his uncle's shadow, a young man who seemed almost unremarkable beside the thunder of Shirkuh's reputation. And yet history often hides its lions in the guise of lambs until the hour strikes. His rise did not begin with grand declarations, but with endurance. When Shirkuh, serving under Nur ad-Din, launched campaigns into Egypt to wrest it from Fatimid, chaos and crusader pressure, young Yusuf rode with him. Imagine the crossing into Egypt, endless deserts swallowing the horizon, men staggering under the weight of heat and thirst, supply lines snapping under the merciless sun. It was not glory that Yusuf learned in those campaigns, but logistics, patience, and the crushing reality that armies are as mortal as the men within them. Shirkuh was the blade, impulsive, daring, at times reckless. Yusuf was the sheath, quiet, calculating, absorbing every lesson of success and every scar of failure. When Shirkuh finally rose to power in Egypt, Yusuf stood by his side, a dutiful lieutenant. And when Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, it was Yusuf, still young, still underestimated, who stepped into the vacuum. At first, it seemed temporary, a matter of convenience. Who was this quiet Kurdish man to rule Egypt? But Nur ad-Din and the Fatimid court both underestimated the iron forming beneath his humility. Within 2 years, Salahuddin, no longer just Yusuf, had dissolved the Fatimid Caliphate, returning Egypt to the Abbasid fold. It was a move both daring and dangerous, an act that realigned the Muslim world's fractured compass, and in that act something crystallized. The quiet boy from Tikrit, once seen as an obedient shadow, had become the center of gravity. His rise was not explosive. It was steady, deliberate, like a tide creeping higher until one day you realize the shore has disappeared. From this point onward, Salahuddin was no longer just a name in the margins. He was a player in the great game of empires, a man who would not only confront crusaders, but unite a broken world before facing them. When Salahuddin secured Egypt, he inherited not a prize, but a labyrinth. Cairo was a jewel, yes, but a fragile one, riddled with conspiracies, religious divides, and opportunists who would sooner poison a cup than face a blade. The Fatimid caliphs had ruled for centuries with Shia doctrine, and their bureaucracy was thick with loyalists who did not welcome this Sunni outsider now claiming authority. Salahuddin moved carefully, dismantling the Fatimid power structure not with a single stroke, but piece by piece, like a physician extracting poison from a wound. He replaced judges, appointed scholars loyal to Sunni orthodoxy, and established mosques where the Abbasid caliph's name was once again pronounced in the Friday sermon. But perhaps his greatest move was not political, it was moral. He lived simply, avoiding the pomp that often swallows rulers whole. He refused indulgent banquets, ate what his men ate, and kept his household free from extravagance. Cairo, a city used to rulers whose decadence was legend, looked upon this restraint with surprise. In the silence of his chambers, where marble halls had echoed with excess, now lived a man who prayed before he planned, who weighed decisions like gold, and who carried himself not as a conqueror, but as a servant of something higher. This is how he won hearts before he commanded them, by convincing people he was not there to exploit Egypt, but to heal it. From Egypt, Salahuddin turned his gaze northward to Syria, where Nur ad-Din still ruled, and where tensions between the two men were growing. Nur ad-Din had been Salahuddin's master, the one who had opened the doors of power to him. Yet power is a living thing, and it does not tolerate equals. Nur ad-Din worried that Salahuddin's control of Egypt made him too strong, too independent. Letters exchanged between Damascus and Cairo grew sharper, alliances more brittle, but fate intervened in the form of death. Nur ad-Din died suddenly in 1174, leaving behind a young son and a power vacuum in Syria. Here was Salahuddin's moment, and he seized it with both patience and force. He marched into Damascus not as a conqueror but as a protector, pledging loyalty to the young heir, even as he quietly took the reins of authority. Cities followed one by one, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, until Syria itself bent beneath his steady will. He did not shatter Nur ad-Din's legacy. He absorbed it, fusing Egypt and Syria under his banner. For the first time in generations, the Muslim world was beginning to cohere, not in fragments but in unity, and that unity bore the name of Salahuddin. Yet unity invited challenge. The Crusader. Lords, watching from their castles in Jerusalem and beyond, understood what was forming and trembled at it. They had thrived on division, on Muslim princes quarreling while they held the coastlines. Now, for the first time, they faced a storm gathering on both sides of their fragile kingdoms. Salahuddin was not yet the roaring lion, but the growl had begun, and those who listened closely to the desert winds knew something unstoppable was coming. The storm that would define Salahuddin's destiny began not with clashing swords, but with patience and provocation. The Crusader states, fragile as they were, could not tolerate the rise of a leader who threatened their lifeline. Jerusalem, ruled by King Baldwin IV, the leper king, a young monarch whose body betrayed him even as his will burned fierce, watched uneasily as Salahuddin consolidated Egypt and Syria for years. Baldwin had managed to keep the Crusader states alive through courage and cunning, but time was his enemy, and his body was failing. In this fragile moment, a reckless hand struck the match. Reynald of Chatillon, the infamous lord of Kerak. Reynald was everything Salahuddin was not: greedy, cruel, impulsive. He attacked Muslim caravans, breaking truces with blood, even seizing pilgrims on their way to Mecca. To Salahuddin, this was not merely insult. It was sacrilege. He vowed that Reynald would pay personally, not with ransom, but with his life. And yet he did not rush. He waited, weaving alliances, strengthening supply lines, turning his armies into rivers that could flow swiftly across deserts. The Crusaders still believed him to be the same cautious general, slow to anger, unwilling to gamble, but they were wrong. The lion was awake, and when he roared, entire kingdoms would tremble. That roar came at the horns of Hattin. In the summer of 1187, picture it, the land near Tiberias, parched under a punishing sun, the Crusader army lured into the open, away from water, away from their fortresses. Salahuddin's strategy was mercilessly precise. He allowed them to march, step after agonizing step, into the furnace of July heat. His cavalry harassed their flanks, cutting them off from Lake Tiberias, the only salvation in sight. Imagine the Crusaders' desperation, armor scorching their skin, tongues swollen with thirst, dust choking their lungs. At night, Salahuddin's men set the dry grass ablaze, filling the air with smoke and suffocating. Heat by dawn, the Crusader army was broken in spirit before a single decisive clash. When battle finally came, it was not a contest, it was annihilation. The true cross, their most sacred relic, was captured. King Guy of Jerusalem was taken prisoner, along with Reynald of Chatillon. And here, history freezes on a moment that reveals the man behind the general. In Salahuddin's tent, Reynald was brought before him. The man who had desecrated holy caravans, who had spilled innocent blood, who had sworn to march on Mecca itself, now stood trembling. Salahuddin offered King Guy water, a gesture of mercy. But when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, Salahuddin interjected coldly, "It is not for him." And then, with his own hand, he executed Reynald. Swift, uncompromising justice. To Guy, he said, "It is not the custom of kings to kill kings." Mercy and vengeance balanced in a single moment. The world had just seen the true face of the lion, righteous fury sheathed within disciplined restraint. Hattin was not merely a battle, it was a turning of the tide. Within months, cities fell, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. The gates of Jerusalem had seen rivers of blood before. In 1099, when the Crusaders first stormed the Holy City, chroniclers wrote of carnage so complete that corpses piled in the streets and blood ran in crimson currents down stone alleys. Christian knights bathed in conquest, leaving mosques desecrated, synagogues torched, and survivors hunted like shadows. That memory still hung in the air, a ghost in every stone, when Salahuddin's army surrounded Jerusalem in October 1187. The city, now under the command of Balian of Ibelin, prepared for a desperate defense. The Crusader knights knew what had been done by their own ancestors nearly a century earlier, and they feared that this time vengeance would answer. Vengeance. Women wept in the churches, men sharpened blades with shaking hands, and the streets whispered with dread. If Jerusalem fell, would it drown in fire and slaughter again? But Salahuddin was not a man of spectacle, he was a man of balance. His army pressed the siege, battering the walls with relentless precision. Yet even as his catapults hurled stones and his ladders crept up the battlements, his messengers carried terms. He offered surrender with safety, urging the city to yield without bloodshed. Balian pleaded for mercy, knowing resistance would mean ruin. In the end, after fierce but brief resistance, Jerusalem capitulated on October 2nd, 1187. What followed was not the nightmare many feared, but a scene that stunned the medieval world. There was no massacre. There were no rivers of blood. Instead, Salahuddin set a ransom for the inhabitants, allowing those who could pay to leave freely, and even freeing many of those who could not. He permitted Christian worship to continue in their churches, protected the holy sites of all three faiths, and ensured that Jews, banished since the Crusader conquest, could once again return to their homes in Jerusalem. Imagine that moment, the Dome of the Rock cleansed not by destruction, but by reverence. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still standing, its bells allowed to toll. Jewish families stepping back into a city they had been exiled from for 88 years. When news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, it was like an earthquake splitting. The continent bells tolled in sorrow, kings swore oaths of vengeance, and the cry for a new crusade thundered through cathedrals. This was no longer a distant skirmish, it was a wound to Christendom itself. From that wound, the Third Crusade was born, summoning giants of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip the Second of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. They would march east to reclaim what Salahuddin had taken, yet in the Holy City itself, the mood was different. For the first time in living memory, Jerusalem breathed without slaughter. The man who had been feared as a scourge revealed himself as something far more dangerous to his enemies. A conqueror whose justice undermined their propaganda, whose restraint became his sharpest weapon. The Third Crusade was not a march. It was a thunderclap when Europe learned that Jerusalem had fallen. It was as if the soul of Christendom had been ripped out of its chest. Kings who had spent their lives at odds suddenly turned their gaze eastward. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, set out with an army so vast it seemed less like a campaign than a migration. Philip the Second of France raised his banners, and Richard Plantagenet, Richard the Lionheart, whose very name dripped with legend, before he ever crossed the sea, swore to reclaim the Holy City. It was an assembly of monarchs unmatched in medieval history, the kind of gathering that turned whispers of crusade into a storm of certainty. But destiny plays cruel tricks. Barbarossa drowned in a river before he could even see the Levant. Philip quarrelled with Richard and eventually returned to Europe, and so the stage narrowed until it revealed two figures: Richard the Lionheart, the embodiment of crusading zeal, and Salahuddin, the lion who had made Jerusalem his own two predators, circling, measuring, locked in a duel that would outlive both of them. Their confrontation was not a single battle, but a series of clashes and negotiations, feints and counterstrokes, stretching from Acre to Arsuf, from Jaffa to the very gates of Jerusalem. At Acre, after a brutal siege, Richard recaptured the city, but the prisoners taken, thousands of them, became a dark mark. On his legend impatient and calculating, Richard ordered their execution when negotiations with Salahuddin stalled, a massacre that stood in sharp contrast to the mercy Salahuddin had shown at Jerusalem, and yet the respect between the two men never vanished. At Arsuf in 1191, Salahuddin's forces tested Richard's knights, launching wave after wave of cavalry attacks. The desert shook with the sound of hooves, arrows darkened the sky, and dust turned the horizon into a blur of chaos. For hours, Richard held his men steady, refusing to break their disciplined formation. When at last he gave the order, the charge of the Crusader knights was like a thunderbolt, cutting through Salahuddin's lines with terrifying force. It was a victory for Richard, but not a rout, for Salahuddin's army withdrew intact, ready to fight another day. And fight they did, skirmishing, maneuvering, both leaders locked not only in war, but in a strange dance of admiration. There are stories, half history, half legend, that reveal the strange humanity in their rivalry. When Richard fell ill, Salahuddin sent him fresh fruits and snow from the mountains to cool his fever. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Salahuddin sent him another, refusing to allow his opponent the indignity of fighting on foot. These gestures did not make them allies, but they carved something deeper: respect. In an age when mercy was seen as weakness, Salahuddin turned it into power, and Richard, for all his ferocity, recognized in him an equal, a man who fought not as a barbarian, but as a knight. Of another creed, the war dragged on. Neither side able to claim total victory, Richard reached the gates of Jerusalem but never entered, his army too weakened, his supply lines too stretched. At last, in 1192, the two lions laid down their claws. A treaty was signed. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe passage to the holy sites. It was not the triumph Europe had dreamed of, nor the destruction Salahuddin's enemies had feared. It was something rarer: balance. When the dust of war settled and treaties quieted the clash of swords, Salahuddin returned not to triumphal parades or gilded halls, but to the burdens of rule. He had risen higher than any man of his generation, master of Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and the holy city itself, yet power never clung to him the way it did to lesser men. His companions described a ruler who lived almost like a monk among princes. His cloak was simple wool, his meals were sparse, his chamber bare. He gave away so much in charity that by the end of his life he would leave behind barely enough to pay for his own burial shroud. Imagine that. One of the most powerful kings of the medieval world dying with no gold to his name. Only debts of generosity, while Europe's monarchs hoarded treasuries and built palaces as monuments to themselves. Salahuddin built his legacy in the loyalty of his people and the memory of his mercy. Those who met him spoke of a man both grave and gentle. He could laugh easily, yet he never mocked. He could be fierce in war, yet he never gloried in cruelty. Chroniclers noted that he wept during the recitation of the Quran, that he rose for prayer in the quietest hours of night, that he ruled with a conscience tuned not to ambition, but to accountability before God. And this humanity was not hidden. It radiated through his decisions. He refused to indulge in court intrigues. He listened to scholars with patience, and he sought counsel not only from generals, but from men of faith. His justice was not abstract. It was felt in the lives of merchants who could trade without fear, peasants who could till the soil without armies trampling their harvest, and pilgrims who could walk the roads of Palestine with the certainty of protection. Perhaps the most striking thing about Salahuddin was that even his enemies could not help but admire him. Richard the Lionheart, who had crossed swords with him, once remarked that no man had ever fought more honorably. Christian chroniclers, who had every reason to paint him as a villain, instead immortalized him as the very model of chivalry. Think about that. In an age where propaganda was as sharp as steel, Salahuddin shattered the mold. He was not remembered as a barbarian, but as a knight among knights, so much so that centuries later European poets and kings would invoke his name with reverence, even longing. Yet beneath the armor of myth, he remained startlingly human. He grew tired. He grew sick. He longed for peace as much as he prepared for war. And when illness finally overtook him in 1193 in Damascus, he faced death with the same humility that had marked his life as he lay dying. A herald carried his shroud through the streets, crying out, "Behold, the King of the East who conquered the lands, for whom wealth and glory were like dust. He leaves this world with nothing but this cloth in which he will be buried." No treasure, no monuments, no castles carved with his name. Only the story of a man who had held empires in his grasp, but refused to be enslaved by them. But every empire, no matter how vast, reaches a crossroads where its fate hangs in the balance. For Alexander, this moment came when his army began to whisper of exhaustion, of longing for home, of a war without end. They had marched farther than any Greek soldier before them, across deserts, rivers, and mountains, chasing the shadow of their king's ambition. The weight of years in foreign lands pressed upon their spirits. And for the first time, Alexander faced not a foreign enemy, but resistance from within his own ranks. His men loved him, they would die for him, but their loyalty was strained by endless conquest. Here, the God-King who never knew limits stood, face to face with the limits of human endurance. Would he push them further into the unknown, or turn back toward the world he had already conquered? The decision Alexander made in that moment did not only determine the path of his army, it revealed the price of chasing immortality. For the dream that burns brightest is also the one that consumes its bearer. The fastest, Alexander turned back, but something within him had shifted. The endless horizon that once called him forward now lay behind him, conquered but never satisfied. He had touched the edges of the known world, yet the fire that had driven him burned with a new restlessness, an emptiness victory could not fill. In Babylon, the city he chose as the heart of his empire, he sought to weave together Persians, Greeks, and countless peoples into one vast civilization. Yet whispers of betrayal, political unrest, and the weight of ruling a fractured empire began to erode the clarity of his vision. The conqueror who once commanded storms now found himself surrounded by shadows, of enemies unseen, of allies uncertain, and of mortality itself creeping closer with each passing day. For the first time, the invincible Alexander seemed human. His body weakened, his mind haunted by the vastness of what he had built and the impossibility of holding it together. The man who once believed the world could be his began to realize that even gods in human form cannot escape the slow erosion of time. In the summer of 323 BCE, in the palace of Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Some said it was fever, others whispered of poison. But whatever the cause, the invincible warrior who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had defied death 100 times on the battlefield, was suddenly brought low by an invisible enemy within his own body. For days he lay in silence, unable to speak, his commanders watching in despair as the man they followed to the ends of the earth slipped away. Soldiers who once marched fearlessly through blood and fire now wept outside his chambers, begging the gods for a miracle, but the miracle never came. At just 32 years of age, Alexander, the man who had never lost a battle, the man who united the known world, took his final breath. His death was not just the end of a king, it was the death of a dream, a vision of unity and greatness that crumbled into chaos the moment his body grew cold. And in that silence, the world learned a truth it could never forget. Even the greatest conqueror cannot conquer death. When Alexander's body was carried out of Babylon, his empire was already beginning to unravel. He had left behind no clear successor, only an infant son and generals whose loyalty had been bound to him alone, not to any crown, not to any throne, but to Alexander himself. Without him, unity shattered like glass. The men who once fought side by side for glory now turned their swords on each other, carving the empire into pieces. His closest friends, men who had laughed with him, bled with him, and watched him rise from prince to godlike ruler, betrayed one another for fragments of his world cities that had once carried his banner now declared their independence. Kingdoms that trembled at his shadow suddenly dared to resist, and the dream of a single world under one rule dissolved into chaos. It was as if Alexander's death unlocked a curse, proving that an empire built by one man's vision cannot survive. The absence of that man's breath, the glory of Alexander lived on in legend, but the empire he fought so fiercely to create became nothing more than a battlefield for those who once called him king. And yet, though his empire crumbled into dust, Alexander himself did not vanish. His story refused to be buried with his bones. Across centuries and continents, his name echoed. Alexander the Great, the boy who became a god, the man who conquered the impossible. In Europe, kings and emperors whispered his name as a standard they could never surpass. In Asia, poets and storytellers spoke of him as if he were more myth than man, a figure chosen by fate itself. Even in lands he never set foot upon, his legend spread like fire, painting him as the eternal conqueror, the eternal dreamer he had achieved. What most men dare not even imagine, he had reached beyond mortality, carving his memory into the very fabric of human history. Though his cities fell and his generals betrayed him, though time erased his empire, Alexander himself remained unconquered. For in the end, true greatness is not measured in crowns or kingdoms, but in the stories told long after death. And if you are watching this now, thousands of years later, it means one thing. Alexander never truly died. He still lives, not on a throne of marble or gold, but in the throne of memory, where no empire can crumble and no sword can reach. So ask yourself this: what does it mean to live a great life? Is it to conquer nations, to command armies, to be remembered as a god among men? Or is it something deeper, something hidden within the way one life can ignite the imagination of thousands of years to come? Alexander proved one eternal truth. You can lose everything, your empire, your wealth, your throne. But if your story burns bright enough, time itself will bend to carry your name. That is why you still whisper his name today. That is why the world still remembers him. When so many kings before and after have been forgotten, greatness is not about how long you rule. It's about how deeply you are remembered. And Alexander is remembered still. If you felt the weight of his story, if you felt the fire of destiny in his journey, then you already carry a piece of his legend within you. Subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. There are countless forgotten legends, warriors, kings, philosophers, whose stories still wait in the shadows of history, and together we will bring them back to life, because some names must never be forgotten.